When it comes to drugs, it seems like the CIA knows best. Welcome to an introductory course in Operation MKUltra. My intention is to link Ye's comments about being drugged and hospitalized to the real-life experiences of so many Americans and Canadians who weren't celebrities, but just regular people. Regular people going about living their lives who were experimented on and drugged constantly, sometimes for weeks to months on end, in order to come up with a formula for brainwashing and mind control. You might think it's fake news, you might think it's a conspiracy theory, but it's all real.
I was given a glass of Kool-Aid, and so were the other children. This Kool-Aid was spiked with LSD. It was horrible.
In the early days of the Cold War, the CIA ordered the creation of a secret program intended to find ways of mind control. They funded an army of psychiatric institutions across the United States and Canada to perform experiments on unsuspecting patients using psychedelic drugs, sensory deprivation, electroshock treatment, and more. The program was known by its code name, MKUltra. At the end of the Korean War, a number of freed American POWs came home seemingly brainwashed and espousing communist propaganda. American officials suspected that the soldiers had been subjected to what they thought were new communist mind control techniques. Alarmed by the situation, the newly formed CIA allocated $25 million for psychiatric experiments on human beings.
It was the most secret program ever conducted by the CIA in the United States. Patients at psychiatric hospitals, prisoners in federal institutions, and even people in the public were given drugs without their awareness or consent and experimented upon.
Initial projects within MKUltra included Operation Midnight Climax.
They established what were called safe houses, where prostitutes would lure men to these apartments. And then once the men were in the apartments, they were dosed with LSD. And then they were basically studied by CIA scientists, usually behind a two-way mirror.
Another common practice was the hosting and observing of LSD-induced parties with live music. These parties were called acid tests, and the culture that grew out of them played a key role in the development of the hippie and psychedelic movements a few years later. However, some of the most damaging experiments occurred at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, Canada. There, under the direction of infamous Scottish-American psychiatrist Dr. Ewan Cameron, unsuspecting patients, many of whom had common ailments such as postpartum depression, were experimented on with aggressive drug cocktails and extreme techniques.
My father was a victim of Dr. Cameron. He was a 27-year-old healthy skier, canoeer, very athletic, and he had asthma. They told him if he went to the Allen Memorial, they could cure his asthma.
My father, Charles, was a patient of Dr. Cameron's. He had a trigeminal neuralgia, it's called, where there's a pain in the temple that radiates into the jaw that apparently is excruciatingly painful. They told him that it was psychosomatic, which it's not, but in those days, what did they know? So they sent him to a shrink. This shrink that he went to was working with Cameron, although we didn't know. So he put my father right into the program.
I was having trouble with my parents. My father and my stepmother decided to put me in the Allen Memorial Institute. They had no idea what went on in there. I was 16 when I was there.
Dr. Cameron pursued a concept he called depatterning, which was meant to reduce patients to an infantile psychological state wherein doctors could take advantage of the person's cognitive vulnerability to attempt to rebuild their mind under the doctor's control. A popular method of choice to achieve this was called psychic driving.
The day that my father was brought to the hospital, they immediately put him on insulin, to put him into like an insulin coma. They took clips from the interview with the shrink and put it on tape to run a loop under his pillow while he was put into this sleep treatment.
He also was put in an insulin coma for 36 days with a recording beside him saying that your mother hates you over and over and over and over and over.
That was beside my bed constantly, repeated 250,000 and 500,000 times.
Another common method was the use of extreme Page-Russell electroshock therapy.
Page-Russell shock treatment is approximately 40 to 75 times the strength of a normal shock treatment. So it's really designed to wipe out the memory.
He received 54 high voltage shock treatments, followed by 54 grand mal seizures.
After 27 days of this, they said that they were discouraged because he still had ties to his former life, in that he was asking to see his wife. They decided to give him more Page-Russell shock treatments and put him to sleep for another 30 days.
When patients were released from the Allen Memorial, they and their families' lives would never be the same again.
Well, there's a lot I could not remember after I got out of the Allen. When my family came, I was a zombie. I didn't even know who they were.
He never came out the same. He had a blank look in his eye. He didn't know who we were. He didn't know we were his daughters. He lost his job. We went into poverty after he came out.
He had said in his interview with the shrink that I was the apple of his eye. And after he came home, he started beating me not long after.
In 1973, the MK Ultra program was terminated, and some of the evidence of its activities was systematically erased.
The whole thing was basically discovered because of a whistleblower named John Marks, who wrote the first book really about the program called The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. There were congressional hearings here in the United States in the mid-70s after it had been exposed. And during those hearings, the CIA finally admitted that this program existed. They admitted that it was probably not the right thing to do, but they feigned innocence.
Despite the congressional hearings and marginal interest in the subject in popular culture, most MK Ultra survivors suffered in silence, taking their trauma with them to the grave. Today, having received no formal apology or compensation, the children of some survivors are pursuing a class action lawsuit against the institutions they deem responsible.
The CIA knew that it was breaking, every moral, ethical, and legal law in the books to do these experiments.
They all were behind it. They all knew what they were doing, but they weren't doing it out of care or love. They were doing it out of military and political reasons.
I am on medication now because of what happened to me when I was 16. I have not had any compensation or apology. I want everyone to know in Canada what went on in that horrible, horrible hospital.
While historians and survivors have exposed MK Ultra's exploits to the world, much remains unknown about its extent and wider impact. Given the highly sensitive nature of the program's activity, it is likely this will remain the case for years to come.
I need you to understand that this program, or this operation, started running after the Nuremberg Code was already in effect, right? The Nuremberg Code, established during the Nuremberg trials, that was in 1947, right? This is where the Allies had all the war criminals from Nazi Germany stand trial, right? Some of them were sentenced to death. Some of them were sentenced to life in prison, right? All kind of punishments because of the kind of experiments that they were doing on people. So that code was already established. Yet, you have an operation called MK Ultra rising years after this code is already in place, making anybody who participated in it effectively a war criminal, right? But you heard what the woman said. It was military and it was political. So let's see if any of those things line up when we hear from this guy right here, because the main demarcation of the Nuremberg Code is informed consent. You don't have informed consent from the patient, you should not be performing any experiments on them.
lucky enough to have him as my graduate advisor. And the area that I was interested in was how drugs and food affect muscular performance. And
when you say drugs, are that like performance-enhancing drugs, or are they
all
just
kinds of drugs?
Right, okay.
So working for the military, I wasn't governed by the same laws that the typical person was, so I could...
Now that sounds pretty ominous. All kinds of drugs, working for the military, and not bound to the same laws or principles that other people have. That is already very ominous coming from his mouth.
Look at the impact of certain drugs that are not everyday things. So we looked at a drug called modafinil, which was for narcoleptics. So if you give a soldier this drug, how long could they stay awake for without having any health detriment?
Is that used now as one of these brain drugs? I've heard the name before somewhere.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. Modafinil, it will keep you awake, but it's not a stimulant.
Really?
So if a special forces person has to stay awake for 3 nights waiting for the right opportunity to do whatever they have to do, we could give them modafinil and it would keep them alert. I did research on a drug called acetazolamide, which is for use at high altitude so you don't get altitude sickness.
Then let's have a conversation. But you ain't gonna send Harley Pasternak.
You're not going to send Harley Pasternak. And that's why his name came up first, right? He's the one, allegedly, who was doing these things. Well, doesn't seem like allegedly, because there is that text from him saying he would do it again. So I need people to be aware of these things. It exists. It happens. It has happened. The CIA will say, oh, well, we stopped it since 1973. If they were getting results from it, I'm pretty sure they haven't stopped it. They've just taken it way underground so that the average person can't find it. But it's already out in the open. The Manchurian Candidate movie is proof that they'll put it in your face and you'll think, oh, it's just entertainment, Denzel Washington, Lee Shreve, no, it's all fun and jokes, No, this is real stuff. And obviously, the average person is not going to have knowledge of how to do these things. But a person who's been in the military, probably, let's say, intelligence, counterintelligence, maybe psychological operations, they might have some knowledge of these things passed on to them. Especially if they're in some type of secret or elite group. And who knows what they'll use these skills for when they're out. Something nefarious? Perhaps, there's a good chance. I think that's what we've seen. Anyways, that's my time. Be sure to subscribe, like the video, share it with someone you know. Until next time.